I'm Emily Kaisinga, a member of the worship arts team. Today's service is going to stretch us. The term white supremacy brings up many feelings: defensiveness, guilt, shame, denial. I'd like to invite us today to approach our feelings when we hear this term white supremacy with curiosity. Why does it make us feel the way that it does? What about me is triggered by it, and why? And how can I not be distracted by semantics and focus on what truly matters about this work? When I think about my own experience exploring issues of white supremacy culture and my own white privilege, a very particular formative event comes to mind. First, some background. I've always taken great pride in my family's history of activism. My parents have been deeply involved in social justice work my whole life, and so were their parents before that. My dad's father, as a matter of fact, was on the organizing committee which brought Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to a rally in Fresno in 1964. A bomb threat was called into Fresno PD before the rally. My grandparents received phone calls where they were called racial slurs and then hung up on as a result of their activism. They were on the right side of history when it wasn't easy to do. This is a big part of my family's legacy, one that I'm very proud of. And I was raised in the Unitarian Universalist Church of Fresno. I mean, how much more right on can you be? So flash forward to 2010, and I'm working at a school in Oakland Unified School District, which is engaging in some deep equity work with stakeholders at the school. I was completely invested and so excited to be learning more about recognizing my own white privilege and how I could better support my students of color in Oakland. We had a weekend retreat where various stakeholders, including parents from the school community, got together to learn and reflect. During one portion of the meeting, we were reflecting on a lived experience of a person of color. I began sharing my perspective, trying to empathize and relate to the story, and one of the prominent Black parents at the school admonished me for speaking up and explained her perspective on how I could never understand what it was like to be a person of color. My memory of the details of the rest of the conversation are a little foggy, but I remember feeling very defensive and misunderstood. The next week at school, I was sharing this experience with a trusted white colleague and explained how frustrated I was that this parent didn't give me the benefit of the doubt. She doesn't know anything about me, I said. She doesn't know my politics or how my grandparents organized with Dr. King or how I grew up going to anti-war marches. I took a lot of time expressing my hurt to her. When I was done venting, she calmly offered a perspective I will never forget. Maybe that is our burden as white people, she said. People of color don't owe it to us to trust us or to assume that we're allies, even if we're showing up in the right places or appearing to do the work. Our burden is to show them that we are allies through our actions, which will speak louder than our words, and continue to show them time and time again to earn their trust. Of course, it doesn't feel good for your support of the cause to be questioned, but this seems like a pretty minor issue compared to the kinds of issues our friends of color face on a daily basis. Whew. This wasn't really about me, and I did exactly the thing that is so frustrating for so many people of color in equity work. I centered myself. My perspective, my opinions, my feelings. Yes, what I had to add was supportive. Yes, I was invested in the work, but I wasn't listening. And I reacted defensively and with fragility when a person of color was trying to teach me something that I probably needed to hear. When people talk about doing the work, I think a lot of that work for white people involves work on ourselves and the way that we relate to and listen to others, especially people of color. It involves putting our feelings aside and really centering those most impacted by white supremacy culture. It also involves white people having hard conversations with each other, something that I'm so glad that my white colleague in Oakland was willing to do with me. There is a quote from Ijumo Oluwa's book, So You Want to Talk About Race, which really speaks to me. She writes, "You have to get over the fear of facing the worst in yourself. You should instead fear unexamined racism. Fear the thought that right now you could be contributing to the oppression of others and you don't know it. But do not fear those who bring that oppression to light. Do not fear the opportunity to do better." May we be open to those who bring oppression to light, whatever terms they use to describe those injustices, and may we be unafraid to do better.
So a little context for today's sermon. I was asked by the Mosaic Makers team, which is the group of church leaders who are challenging us to live more fully into our vision of being a truly multiracial, cultural congregation, as well as Riva and Ellis, who have been leading some of the very challenging book discussions. And they asked me to, in a way, to go back to the basics and to talk a little bit about white supremacy culture, white privilege, decentering whiteness, and everyone's favorite, white fragility. This Friday afternoon, I received a text from my friend Petey. His text said, "Annie gave me permission to share it. Hey Tim, I just saw on Facebook the title of your sermon for Sunday. I hate to say it, but sermons like that are the reason I'm no longer going to my Unitarian Universalist church. I want to go to church to get renewed spiritually, not to be made to feel guilty for being a white person. Even worse, a white male. My family didn't enslave people. You know, I marched for voting rights in the 60s, and I vote for candidates who reflect my values. I'm a progressive, and I do my best, and I don't need to be called a white supremacist when I go to church." Today's sermon title clearly states, you are not a white supremacist. I'm not calling any of us here today a white supremacist. But I am saying that all of us were born into a society that is structured on the belief that white Europeans and their descendants are superior to people with darker skin. That means we've all been enculturated into a society that is based on white supremacy. I don't think that any of the white persons who are here today are a white supremacist. But the larger society and culture in which we live is white supremacy. Let me be clear. I don't want anyone here to feel guilty because they are white. But I do believe part of our collective spiritual work, no matter our racial identity, is to liberate each other from the societal chains that keep us tied to practices that center white people. Even if our family didn't enslave others, even if we marched for voting rights in the 60s, even if we are voting for candidates that support our values, even if we identify as a progressive, part of our collective spiritual work is to liberate each other from the societal chains that keep us tied to practices that center white people. Dr. Robin DiAngelo, a noted author on race, pointedly writes that we are living in a country that gives constant messages that white people are more valuable, are better, and more important than people of color. Look at white people's centrality in history textbooks. Look at white people's centrality in media and advertising and film. Or look at the religious images that depict God, Adam and Eve, and Jesus as white. I remember my childhood Bible. Jesus had blue eyes and blonde hair. Jesus was Middle Eastern. Notice, she continues, that an individual person of color can sit at the tables of power, Kamala Harris, Ketanji Brown Jackson, but the overwhelming majority of decision makers will be white. While we all may explicitly reject the notion that one race is inherently better than the other, we cannot avoid internalizing the message of white superiority as it is ever present in our mainstream society. As Unitarian Universalists, we are trying to liberate each other from that mainstream. But that is still the stream in which our society swims. One that holds the message that there is no inherent value in the presence or perspectives of people of color. And today, this stream is getting stronger, more vocal, and more frighteningly aggressive as politicians, states, universities, school boards, libraries are implementing policies that are suppressing history, canceling our freedom of speech, and trying to create an apartheid America centered on white people. Now, I grew up white in a country that bestowed upon me whiteness. White is the common word used to describe the pigment in my skin. Whiteness is the socialized superiority that comes with it. As writer Toni Morrison noted, in this country, American means white. Everyone else has to hyphenate. African American, Cuban American, Asian American, Mexican American, American. According to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, notice a hyphenated museum, whiteness and white racialized identity refer to the way that white people, their customs, cultures, and beliefs operate as the standard by which all other groups of people are compared. Whiteness, they say, is also at the core of understanding race in America. Whiteness and the normalization of white racial identity have created a culture where non-white persons are seen as inferior or abnormal. This white-dominated culture also operates as a social mechanism that grants advantages to white people since they can navigate society both by feeling normal and as being viewed as normal. Persons who identify as white rarely have to think about their racial identity because they live within a culture where whiteness has been normalized. The museum goes on to say, thinking about race is very different for non-white people living in America. People of color must always consider their racial identity, whatever the situation, due to the centering of whiteness and the systemic and interpersonal racism that still exists. Now, for me, personally, these privileges that come from my whiteness, from being part of the dominant culture, are mostly invisible to me, but not by those oppressed or disadvantaged by it. As described in the article, Key Features of Whiteness, whiteness is a set of privileges granted to white-skinned individuals and groups. It is a reality based on beliefs, behaviors, habits, and attitudes that result in the unequal distribution of power and privilege based on skin color. It shapes how white people view themselves and others, and puts white people in a place of structural advantage where white cultural norms and practices go unnamed and unnoticed. Cultural racism is founded in the belief that whiteness is considered to be universal and allows one to think and speak as if whiteness described and defined the world. Would you say that with me, please? Cultural racism is founded in the belief that whiteness is considered to be universal and allows one to think and speak of whiteness described and defined the world. And that, dear ones, is why it is called white supremacy culture, which, according to author Robin DiAngelo, becomes this multidimensional system that ensures an unequal distribution of resources between racial groups, because whites built and dominate most significant institutions. Their interests are embedded in the foundations of U.S. society. The National Museum of African American History and Culture notes, these benefits and advantages of varying degrees are known as white privilege. Being white does not mean you haven't experienced hardships or oppression. It means that you have not faced hardships or oppression based on the color of your skin. If you are white in America, you have benefited from the color of your skin. I benefit from white supremacy culture. And if you identify as white, so do you. In the early days, as what was then termed a diversity trainer, author Robin DiAngelo was shocked by how angry and how defensive some white people became at the suggestion that they benefited or were connected in any way to racism. But over time, DiAngelo began to understand the beliefs that propped up some white people's racial responses. DiAngelo writes, "We are taught to think about racism only as discrete acts committed by individual people rather than as a complex, interconnected system. If I believed that only bad people who intended to hurt others because of race could ever do so, I too would respond with outrage at any suggestion that I was involved in racism. Of course, that belief would make me feel falsely accused of something terrible. And of course, I would want to defend my character." She continues, "I came to see that the way we are taught to define racism makes it virtually impossible for some white people to understand it. Any suggestion that we are complicit in racism is a kind of unwelcome and insulting shock. The result D'Angelo writes, is that some white people become highly fragile in conversations about race. Those of us who are white consider a challenge to our racial worldviews as a challenge to our very identities as good, moral people. Thus, we perceive any attempt to connect us to the system of racism as an unsettling and unfair moral offense, and it often triggers a range of defensive responses. This includes emotions such as anger, fear, guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal. Rob and D'Angelo collectively calls this white fragility. White fragility is defensiveness when issues of race are raised. White fragility turns the tables, and as Emily so beautifully shared, focuses on a white person's discomfort or sense of somehow being wronged, instead of keeping the focus where it belongs, on the discomfort or concerns of the people of color who are impacted by our white supremacy culture every day of their lives. D'Angelo even suggests these fragility responses work to reinstate white equilibrium as they repel the challenge, return our racial comfort, and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy. D'Angelo also issues a challenging assessment. And this one, dear ones, is going to be hard for some of us to hear. And so I invite us to breathe into any discomfort we may feel, and let us try to hear D'Angelo's words, not as a judgment, but as an invitation to consider a perspective that may be different from our own. These words aren't meant to make us feel guilty. They're meant to make us think. And in thinking, then we're free to do whatever we want with D'Angelo's observation. D'Angelo writes, white progressives so often, despite our conscious intentions, make life difficult for people of color. D'Angelo continues, I define a white progressive as any white person who thinks they are not racist, or is less racist, or in the choir, or already gets it. White progressives, she says, can be the most difficult for people of color because to the degree that we think we have arrived, we will put our energy into making sure that others see us as having arrived. Little of our energy will go into what we need to be doing for the rest of our lives, which is engaging in ongoing self-awareness, continuing education, relationship building, and actual anti-racist practice. To the degree that we think we have arrived, little of our energy will go into what we need to be doing for the rest of our lives. Engaging in ongoing self-awareness, continuing education, relationship building, and actual anti-racist practice. One such opportunity begins next Sunday at 12:30 as we offer a 4-week discussion and learning experience called an Anti-Racist Symphony, diverse readings for intercultural growth, based on short readings from noted award-winning authors of color, as well as white author Robin DiAngelo, whose work has informed today's sermon and made at least a few of us uncomfortable. My friends, as Unitarian Universalists, we believe in the inherent dignity and worthiness of every human life. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe that all life is interconnected and interdependent. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe love is the center of our beloved faith. Love is the driving force in our faith in humankind and its potential. We know that nothing external is going to save us from ourselves. Our strength comes from inside us, from our capacity to learn how to love more fully. This love compels our sacred imperative to build a beloved community brimming with justice, equity, and compassion for every person, regardless of race or cultural background. For us to do this, those of us who are white need to be willing to breathe into those places within us where racial fragility might reside. We need to be willing to commit to calling forth the love that is within us and among us, a love that can transform us, a love that will empower our collective spiritual work, which is to liberate each other from the societal chains that keep us tied to practices that center white people. Then, and only then, will we be living a liberating love. Que así sea, bendito sea. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.